Good morning. How are you guys? Cold? That's fair. That's fair. My name's Dylan. I'm the next gen pastor here, and I don't know how I feel about what Brian said. There's been moments this week that I've really second guessed whether or not I'm the appropriate person to be sitting up here right now. And there's days that I wonder, like, what qualifies me to sit in front of you guys and tell you what God wants for your life? And this was one of those weeks that I had that question. When Brian and I were walking through this sermon series and looking at where it was going to go and the direction that it was going to take and what was on his heart, healing was the goal. Was to address the ugly truth of loss and then to craft a path toward healing. And he looked at me, he says, "Do you want one? Like one of the sermons?" I was like, "Yeah, I don't know." And I felt like this one jumped out to me. And so I said, this is a weird thing to say. I really like the grief one. I said, but give me a couple days to pray on it. Because I had a preaching professor speak to me one time, and he gave me wise advice. He says, you can preach from your scars, but he says, be really cautious when you're preaching from your wounds. And sometimes I feel like grief, this is one of those open wounds. I would love to tell you that, like, I've been there, done that, it's completely healed. And I can tell you, because of my scars, where to go, how to get there, where to stop, where to take a rest, and what to do. But I think I'd be lying. Because the thing that concerns me the most about this topic is that it is sensitive, it is deeply terrifying, and it's personal. And so what qualifies me to be sitting here today? Unfortunate circumstance. But isn't that all of us? I think as I've sat in this space of what is grief, I think I've come to the conclusion that grief is a universal individual experience. Grief is something that we all universally feel and have to navigate, but we do so in uniquely individual ways. And so I'm going to preface, I'm not giving you a one-size-fits-all, this is how you should grieve, and this is how it's going to go, and this is how you should feel when you're done. Because that's not what this is about. Because my grief isn't yours, and yours is not mine. And there's a slew of reasons that I think that. And we talked about this some last week as Brian talked about how we need to broaden our view of loss. Because I think sometimes we get trapped in this idea that loss is just when we lose a human being that's important to us. And that is true. And that is a huge one. And I don't want to discredit that at all. Because losing people that we love dearly is a deeply moving experience, and it hurts, and it's painful, and unfortunately, it should be. But so is losing other things. In the midst of that loss, grief is a tandem. It comes with it, and it's appropriate in its time, but it's difficult. And so I don't want us to get trapped into thinking that a topic of grief is just on that one thing. We did such a good job of stepping outside of those lines last week, and so if you'll be with me, color outside the lines a little bit this week. We don't just grieve the people that we've lost. We grieve the ideas and dreams that we've had for ourselves that now seem unattainable. We grieve job losses and things that we brought up last week. We grieve opportunities that are missed. We grieve so many things. And I'm going to be transparent with you because I'm going to be honest, I don't know what else to do. That's just kind of how I go. I'm in counseling right now to grieve parts of me that are no longer useful. Because as I've gone through life and dealt with different things, I've added defenses and barriers and walls to my life to keep me safe when I felt like I was the only one that could do that. And now as God has entered my life and he's beginning to move things and to heal things and to deal with that loss, I'm learning that I have to grieve the parts of myself that are no longer useful. And so I'm grieving my imperfections. I'm grieving the things that I know now, but I didn't know then, and I wish I could go back, but I can't. And I'm grieving the things that I'm afraid of in the future. I think so many times we anticipate loss, and so we grieve in the present what hasn't even been gone yet, because we've been conditioned to it. We talked last week about how loss entered the world when sin entered the world. And as a result of sin at large, there's brokenness and death and destruction that seeps its way into creation and just wreaks havoc. And that wasn't a part of the design. That may be a part of the story, but it wasn't intended. And so as we wrestle with what that is, I think it's appropriate sometimes that we realize that that's overwhelming. There are times that we are overwhelmed by what we experience and feel in that space of loss because it's outside of what our intended nature was. But it's been happening so long that we've become accustomed to it. We flinch at the sight of what could be. Like a dog that's been abused. Somebody that's calm and gentle and loving comes along and reaches their hand out to pet, and the dog still flinches. I think because we've dealt with loss and brokenness so much that we begin to grieve merely by flinching at the idea of what could be lost. And so today, we're talking about grief. And to be honest with you, I feel like it's appropriate. It's been one of those days I think the only thing I have to say sometimes is good grief. But it's something that we all experience, and we all experience it in different ways. And we jumped into Isaiah last week, and we looked at his depiction of what Israel was. We looked at the loss that they were experiencing and the loss that they were projecting into their future because they were staying in the same space. And so loss was their present, loss was their past, and loss was their future. And we looked at that, and now we have to figure out, what do we do as we sit in that space with it? Because I'm going to be honest, next week is going to be beautiful because we get to look at something new. But today, we just have to sit in the in-between. And I say have to, but the reality should be get to. Because grieving is like one of those in-between spaces. And so as I sat in that this week, I asked myself questions like, what is grief? How are we supposed to grieve? Is there a right way? Is there a wrong way? Does it have to be as awful as I think it's going to be? And the question I think that brought me the most comfort after it scared me the most was, what is God's desire for me in grief? Because if I'm going to seek what he desires for me in this uncomfortable space, I have to accept that he does desire grief for me in some capacity. And so I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a good friend? I mean a really good friend. Somebody that you felt like was always trustworthy, that was always loyal, that was always faithful, that was always there and present, that was always connected, somebody that understood you, somebody that got you, somebody that understood you so well that they finished your sentences for you. They knew where you were going, what you were doing, what you were thinking. They were on the same page as you, and they never failed you. Somebody that loved you always, cared for you always, was honest always, was persistent always. Because I think a good friend loves us well even when we think we don't want love. Have you ever had a good friend like that? You can talk to me, that's okay. Does anybody have a friend like that? My wife and I have some friends like that. And for some of them, we gave them this sign and then we put the other one in our house. And I'm going to be honest, with what we've experienced today and the last couple of years, I think if we had more of these, we'd hand more of them out. But this is what it says. It says, friends pick us up when we fall down. And if they can't pick us up, they sit down and listen for a while. You see, sometimes what we need more than Mr. Fix-It is a friend to sit down and sit with us in what we're experiencing right then and there. And that's what a good friend is all about. And we have a good friend in Jesus. We jumped into this last week just a little bit where Brian talked about how our loss is God's loss. He feels for us. He weeps with us. He weeps for us. He understands us. He empathizes with us. He's compassionate for us. He understands us. He gets us. And he gets the things that we've had to deal with. And one of my favorite things about prayer is that as God has taught me to listen to him more, I am more and more blown away that he takes time to listen to me. And when he listens to me, he understands. But I think often we have a harsh image of God when it comes to this grief topic. And this is why I think that. I think when we have to come to peace with what grief is and what loss is, and we pull the sin aspect into the equation, we get this image of God that is a judge, and we view it as distant and harsh and judgmental and condemning, and he seems justified in it, and it hurts us. This harsh image of God feels so disconnected from this good friend that we think we should have in Jesus. And when we enter this space of grief, sometimes he becomes an object of blame rather than a good friend. He's no longer just listening to us, now it's his fault. Because we don't know what to do in that space. But the good news is, he has skin in the game. You see, God cares deeply, intimately, and intensely, not only about us, but what's going on in our lives. He cares about what we care for. And so, when we grieve that, he grieves. But I think it's hard for us to understand that. I know it's hard for me to understand that. Because I think to be able to hold God as a good friend and hold God as a good judge, we have to shift our perspective. I think we have to shift our perspective away from an either or to a both and. I think we live most of life in an either or mindset. That if I'm going to choose between two things, it's either this one or it's that one. When I go to order a meal at a restaurant, I'm getting this or I'm getting this. Very rarely am I like, yep, I'm getting both and. And that's how we live our life. We live our life in a series of choices. It's either heads or it's tails. You either win or you lose. Someone's either good or they're bad. Or at least that's what we think. Because we live our life that way. If it's black or it's white, it's so much simpler. But you see, God is bigger than that. You see, God is not either or. He is both and. And I think it's going to take a moment for us to stretch our capacity to understand who he is. Because so often we try to fit God into the box that we can understand, and that's not who he is. Because I can fit God as a good judge in a box. I can fit God as a good friend in a box, but somehow that box doesn't have space for both. But if I limit who he is in a moment, that affects how I see him, and that affects how he intervenes in my life. We have to switch our mindset to a both and. And I believe that God is genuinely both and. He is a good judge, and he is a good friend. And I think the best example we have of that is Christ. I know some of us are like, well, we've been in Isaiah so far, and we're going to be in Isaiah today. We're probably going to be in Isaiah next week. And some of y'all were thinking, well, we're in the Old Testament. We got out of that Jesus thing. No. The whole grand narrative of Scripture is about Jesus. You see, the story of God's love for us and his redeeming act in us, with us, and for us, and through us, Jesus is the climax, but he is a part of the whole thing. And so as we jump into Isaiah chapter 53 today, we're going to see a foreshadow of something beautiful that is to come. And so let me set you up a little bit. We're going to jump into chapter 53, but chapter 52, Isaiah has been discussing with the people the loss, the brokenness. He's pleading with them for them to change their ways. He's telling them what is coming if they stay in this same space of destruction. And then he offers them something new. And that something new starts in chapter 52 when he tells them of a coming salvation. Anybody have a guess what that might be? And then he leads in chapter 53 and continues with that same point. He picks up here, we'll jump in verse 2. He says, "For he grew up before them like a young plant." Well, we will know who the he is in just a second. "And like a root out of the dry ground, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. And he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." This is a foreshadowing. Isaiah is telling the people that there's going to be a guy, and he's going to come, and he's going to do these things, and he's going to make a way. And all the sin that has caused brokenness in your life is going to pierce his hands. But then he's going to wipe it away. And all the iniquity that you're carrying into your daily life that's breeding destruction and chaos in your path, he's going to take that too. All the transgressions, mistakes, mishaps, shortcomings, all of that is causing you grief, he's going to take in his arms, embrace upon himself, and wash you clean. And so many times, I've imagined that in my head, and the very first thing I feel is shame. Because that's very personal. That my transgressions, my griefs, my sorrows, my iniquities, those are the things that caused his wounds. But he's not just a good judge, friends. He's a good friend. And what I mean by that is Isaiah is saying this because Jesus chose that. He was not forced into that space. He chose to take on our grief. He chose to take on our pain. He chose to take on our suffering. so that he would understand and be able to create a new way. And because of that, we have a God who has empathized with us. He knows us. He gets us in the good times and the bad. I've had good friends that leave quickly when bad things come. But Jesus is a friend who has suffered with us, who has lost also, who cares and grieves with us. And I want to take a second to paint the picture of the difference between sympathy and empathy, because it explains clearly the beauty of God's love for us. Sympathy, if you're in a hole, and this is how grief feels, I think a lot of times, is you're in a hole and it's dark and it's scary and it's alone and it's cold and you feel isolated and you hate it. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, and that seems appropriate. Sympathy sticks its head down the hole and says, oh, that does not look good. That looks dark. That looks scary. That looks painful. That sucks. And then it leaves. Empathy goes and finds a ladder and climbs down into the hole with us and says, I feel your pain. I understand your loss. I have felt things that you now feel. Me too. I understand. You see, that is the empathy of a good friend. And I think our distant image of a judgmental God is sympathetic. He looks down. He says, yeah, sin, that thing, it sucks. But he didn't leave it there. He went and found a ladder. He climbed down into our hole. He grabbed a hold of us and he says, I feel your pain. I understand your loss. Me too. I get it. You see, God is a good friend. And I bring all of that to the table because grieving alone, I don't think it ever ends. Because we need connection to heal. Grief is something that we have to do with someone. Grief needs a companion. And God is willing to sit with us in our deepest grief and not rush the process. See, I was looking at the 5 stages of grief this week. These are the things that people say universally most people experience these stages. I wouldn't even say that they're all necessarily in the same order. They're definitely not felt in the same ways. But here are your 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And God comes into this space, and he wants to feel all of those things with us. He doesn't want to just skip to the good part. He wants to be with us in all of it because all of it is necessary. And we spend most of our time in stage 1. We spend most of our time in a posture of denying loss because if I avoid it, I don't have to think about it. If I don't think about it, I don't have to feel it. And we don't like how it feels because pain hurts. But pain is a part of the healing. And so we spend time in denial. We distract ourselves with anything that we think might fill the gap. New Year's resolutions. Sometimes I'm so busy grieving the love I don't have for myself that I'm convinced a gym membership will change that. If I look better in the mirror, I will love myself better. That hasn't worked yet. We distract ourselves with social media. If I'm feeling bad things and I watch somebody else that's feeling good things, maybe I can cling to their experience. Or maybe what's worse is if I'm feeling bad things and I watch somebody else go through worse things, maybe I feel better about what's going on in me. We cling to the scroll because it's comfortable, it's distracting, it's numbing, but it's not a cure, it's a medication. We deny with silver linings. This is where most well-intended friends fall short. It's because they step into your grief, and instead of sitting with you where you are, they try to show you the silver lining in the rain cloud. But the truth is, a lot of times, silver lining is just a replacement for what is lost with something that doesn't fit. And so it ignores the loss and then replaces it with something that was never intended to be there in the first place. And we spend so much time denying, because it feels safer that way. Because we don't want to let our guard down to start feeling the things we don't want to feel. But the thing that's keeping us safe is also keeping us wounded. The second stage is anger, and that's an ugly emotion. It's uncomfortable. We hate it. We hate it especially when it's pointed at us. But the truth of the matter is, a wise person once told me that anger is a secondary emotion. It is our response to pain. And so if we allow ourselves to sit with that, we get to the thing that's lying underneath, which leads us to bargaining, which for me most of the time is, how can I convince God to heal my problem my way? How can I convince God to take what I care deeply about that was lost and make it what I want it to be now? And so I bargain with him to do it exactly how I would like him to do it. That normally doesn't work because the brokenness that I'm trapped in, that I'm dealing with, has also affected the way that I think things should be. And so sometimes what I want isn't what I need. And when God tells me, no, you don't really need that. No, you really don't need that, I'm upset. Like a 2-year-old that wants to touch the hot stove. And then I throw my hands up in the air because I've tried everything I can do. And then depression sets in because now I'm hopeless. I can't see a way out because my way out didn't work. And so now I feel numb, I feel exhausted, and I feel like I have lost all hope. And only in that space, when I have surrendered everything that I've tried, am I open to what God has for me. You see, because grief is a process. It takes time to feel all of those things. And I think that there's a really good chance all of those things are fruitful in the right space. I think that there's a chance that all of those things are a good thing for a time. And we have to mourn things as they were before we're ready to embrace them as the new things should be. You see, that is grief. Grief is holding the space for loss and the space for promise. God's promise of redemption in the midst of the reality of our loss, that is grief. Grief is holding both and in the same space. It is the in-between, or as a lot of theologians would say right now, the already but not yet. Because we already know that which is going to be so, so good, but it's not yet here. And so we have to sit in between these things and hold both and. And that is the very best thing that we can do right now, is to hold sadness as it is and as it should be. Because when we lose the things that we love the most, pain is an appropriate response. And then we hold the promise of redemption and hope. Because if we only hold one, it overwhelms. If we only hold sadness without hope, it consumes us. And I don't think there's any way for me to dig myself out of that hole. I have to have the promise of hope, of which Jesus is the key. Jesus is the key for healing. Jesus is the key for redemption. Jesus is the key that is going to meet an old need in a new way, because the old is lost. And he has the patience to wait out the process. Thank goodness. Patience is not one of those things I like to learn. And so, like I said, grief needs a companion. And so as we hold those things in that space, Jesus desires to hold it with us, because we're not postured for that. That's hard. And he's going to hold it with us and teach us a new way. God desires to connect with us in our deepest grief. That is his heart. To understand us, to empathize with us, to be a good friend in the pit. And he wants us to hold that space and help us hold that space for both and. I think the hardest thing for us is we have tried the right thing in the wrong place maybe too many times. Because there's been spaces in my life where I needed to grieve something, and I went to someone longing to embrace a good friend, and I found something else instead. And instead of grieving with me, they tried to fix it. Instead of grieving with me, they told me it was my problem and it was my fault. Instead of grieving with me, they did all the things that Job's friends did. But here's the thing. That's not who God is. God is a good friend. And I think we have to believe for that when we can't know that for certain. Because I am conditioned a certain way to think that something bad is coming when something good is intended. As I was doing sermon prep this week, I was looking at my windowsill and I have 4 cacti lined up. And I heard the Holy Spirit just push. It's like embracing a cactus, Dylan. I said, what? Had absolutely nothing to do with what I was doing in the moment. I went ahead and wrote it on the board anyway. And then I was talking to my wife, and then I was processing things through again this morning. And then I was talking to Brian. That's what it's like. The moments that we have gone to an unsafe person to grieve is like embracing a cactus. It's the right thing done with the wrong person. And so I don't know if you've stepped into an unsafe space before. If you've stepped towards someone in a grieving process, hoping to embrace, but they weren't ready for you. Or they were grieving in their own way, which made them a little prickly. I want you to know. I want you to believe until you can know. That's not who God is. God is a good friend that is holy and perfect and good all the time. So if you're serving communion, you can go ahead and head toward the table. One thing I want to talk about as we approach communion is that, one, this is an open table. If you feel like God is inviting you into this space and he's giving you a seat at his table and he has something that he wants to talk through with you, something that he wants to sit with you in, come to the table. The other thing I want to talk about is lament. You see, we see this pattern of lament in Scripture. There's a whole book, Lamentations. We also see it over and over and over again in Psalms, where David primarily is just pouring out this raw and unfiltered expression of pain. I think our encouragement in grief is that God is big enough to handle whatever we have to throw at him. And he loves us enough to hold us in that space, even when we're ugly about it. And lament sometimes is an ugly thing, because it's almost like a lashing out at God. And I want to make it really clear. He is honorable and worthy of our highest praise. And when I blame him, I think I'm out of line. But I also know that he loves me enough to love me through the process that heals me and heals my image of him to what it should be. And so if you feel like the thing that's resisting you to coming into the presence of Jesus is, well, he can't handle what I have to say to him. Yeah, he can. Yes, he can. If it's ugly, if it's raw, if it's unfiltered, if it stinks, if it's wrong, he would rather you be in his presence doing that than running away from him. And so in this grieving process, I don't know what you have to grieve. I know what I do. I'm going to be busy for a while. He wants to connect with us in that. So even if it's ugly, trust him with it. If you don't feel like you can trust him with it, believe in faith for who he is. And your faith will show you the way that you do not know. So as you come to the table, I want you to come as you are. Don't feel like you have to clean up. Come to the space that Jesus is present. And I want you to take the bread that represents his body that was broken for you, that understands all of your brokenness. And I want you to dip it in the blood that was shed for you, that washes clean the new way. I want you to hold both and I want you to take it at the table with him. And then as you go back to your seat, I want you to listen for whatever he has for you, because he knows what I don't. And I believe that he might know what you don't. But he desires to have your seat at the table.
my strength, you're my defender. You're my refuge in the storm. Through these trials, you've always been.
Am I still on? Oh, cool. My encouragement for you in this space is don't rush it. Be patient with the healing that's happening. I know that this is certain for a lot of people in surgeries. I think it's the same when God's doing deep healing. Don't rush recovery. Don't rush recovery. God needs to lead you through this space and to show you a new way. It's going to be difficult. I think it should be. Don't get ahead of him. My other encouragement is we've talked a lot about a good God, a good friend. If you don't know him yet, if you've only heard about him, I would encourage you to grasp on to what it is to believe for that. Believe for a God who is that. Believe for a love that he has offered you that's worth that. Believe for what he has. Because I think sometimes how he feels about us is hard to understand. And so if you don't understand that, believe for it. Because we have a God who weeps, a God who bleeds, and a God who grieves with us. Will you guys pray with me? God, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the way that you have offered yourself for us, the way that you have met us in our deepest need, and you desire to meet us in our deepest grief. God, I just ask that you would speak clearly. I think in the chaos of grief, sometimes the first thing to leave is clarity. And so, God, give us clearly what you desire for us to do in this space, in this season, and give us patience and peace to walk within your will, even if it's a walk instead of a sprint. And God, let us trust you and believe for who you are. Father, we love you. We praise you. We just want to do everything with our best good friend.